You're live.
Hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome to MHTV for a really interesting subject for you today. We're going to be talking about eco-anxiety and mental health. So before I introduce you to our guest and we get going, let me throw you to Vanessa so that she can tell you how you can join in tonight because we'd love to hear from you. Vanessa?
Hi everyone, welcome. We've got another interesting episode tonight, so we would love you to join in. You can join in, for those of you who follow us every week, you'll know that you can either join us on Twitter by following the hashtag MHTV, and there you'll see the thread and the conversation. Ask questions there. I'll be monitoring it and I can feed those questions, comments into the discussion. If you prefer Facebook, then wander over to Facebook onto the Unite MHNA page. If you like the page there, you'll see the live stream. So follow that there. Again, add comments, do join in. We like conversation, we like participation. So we look forward to you joining in. And I'll hand back over to Nicky.
Fantastic. So let's welcome our guest. Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi everyone, thank you. Yeah, so I am a lecturer in psychology at the University of Brighton, and that means I teach and I also do research. And part of my teaching, one of my teaching topics is ecopsychology, which is about the psychology of the relationship between humans and nature and humans and the wider climate, including the climate crisis, and ecotherapy, which maybe some of the audience are aware of, which is kind of using the principles of connectedness to nature for healing in its broadest sense, including in terms of mental health. And in my research, then I work on theory and research around human-nature connection, human-animal connections in relation to mental health partly, but also in relation to social justice, and in particular in the context of the climate crisis and the Anthropocene.
Okay, I can already feel somebody thinking what's Anthropocene, but we'll come back to that. So obviously we're focusing on eco-anxiety because that's what some of your work's been on very recently. So can you tell us what do you mean by that? What's that about?
Yeah, well, in the way I've written about it, I've just picked up on the term and it's been defined in different ways in different places. So there isn't kind of an agreed definition. There is a movement towards kind of scales and to use it in kind of diagnoses, but we're not quite there yet formally. But basically it's kind of worry, sadness, or other difficult, extreme, maybe emotions that are felt and often felt as distressing in relation to the climate crisis. And that can be in terms of anticipated problems. So looking to the future, what might be happening, what might be going to happen, and worrying about that. And it also covers anxiety and related distress in terms of things that are happening already. So it might be an experience of extreme weather that's linked to climate crisis or drought or so on. So it's kind of, it can fit into that real events or potential anticipated events as well. And then that emotional response to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot for people to process, isn't it? In terms of, so I suppose when you'd be trying to identify it, you'd be looking for things like anxiety, sadness, panic attacks. How would it manifest in terms of what you would see in terms of symptomology?
Yeah, well, not obviously, but the climate crisis is increasingly, we're increasingly aware of it. So all sorts of people worry about it in all sorts of ways and can put it out the way or not. But I guess it's when it becomes debilitating in some ways, so that distress can feel like you can't go on. So it might be in a panic attack. You'll know that might not necessarily, first of all, manifest as the reason for a panic attack, but it could be a kind of low level or background pressure, but it can come out in all sorts of symptoms that we're familiar with, including denial or defense mechanisms where one might actually say or articulate no problem at all with the climate crisis, but manifest it in other kind of defensive behaviors. And they're kind of well known. It might be, out and out reaction formation, which is where people will be critical of those who are focusing on climate crisis, even because they don't want to deal with it. But it could also be more straightforward kind of sadness or real kind of existential crisis, or just a sense of doom that the world's not going to go on, that kind of catastrophism. And it could also be in kind of almost a manic solution focus, where we really want to try and focus on what we can do individually to try and fix this. So yeah, all sorts of behaviors it can be manifested. Yeah,
I can see as well, and like complications with that as well. If you're saying it, what you could also include responses to extreme weather and other types of pressure that's caused by sort of climate catastrophe. And because we know that's not straightforward. I mean, even COVID has shown us that something hits across a population very differently, and the most vulnerable people are the most heavily affected, as they have been in COVID. And I think it's the same in ecological crisis as well.
yeah,
People least able to defend themselves, people with the least amount of money saved up, people in the most vulnerable housing. So
Yeah.
it's going to be a complicated issue when you bring in social justice and all those other issues as well.
absolutely. Sometimes the climate crisis is called a double injustice because those who are the least responsible to date are suffering the worst effects so far. And the research that has been done suggests so far that those who are experiencing the kind of blunt end of the climate crisis in terms of its effects, understandably, are the most distressed. And that comes out in mental health issues as well as material deprivation and so on. So that stress is there, but that's not to suggest that those who are not that close yet are not feeling grief or loss or distress in different ways. It's just, but you're absolutely right. Where we are in the world, where we're situated, in the countries in which we live, in terms of dealing with those, with the fallout of climate crisis as well, still really shapes the landscape in terms of emotional responses individually and also how we respond collectively, I think.
I think that kind of collective response is interesting as well, because it's not uniform, as we rightly say. So you'll have some people who are taking direct action, some people who are very sort of violent towards those people, some people who are climate change deniers, and all that must be feeding into this kind of confusion and distress.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my belief, kind of informed in part by psychoanalysts or depth psychologists a little bit, is that everyone is entangled in some ways in the climate crisis, emotionally and psychologically. I mean, it's unprecedented on a planetary scale to be aware of this scale of problem caused by one species. Okay, not all of one species, and we can argue about different responsibilities, but in the history of the planet, I mean, that's just an existential crisis. It's a really difficult situation to deal with. So we're all plugged into that in some way, however differentially, and that means there's a cultural response and a kind of cultural manifestation of our response to that in all sorts of ways that are often irrational or difficult to explain or even understand.
It's interesting as well, because you talk about it being caused by one species, but also caused by a species who knows they're doing it. That's where it becomes bizarre, I think.
Yes.
And that kind of like knowing, because there's nobody who doesn't understand that something is different and something bad is happening. So it's quite a strange topic, and I can understand why that causes anxiety for people. So how prevalent is this issue? Because it's still quite new.
Yeah, I mean, how prevalent? I mean, there's a couple of large surveys. So the University of Bath one, which I think I mentioned in the conversational article, that basis for this conversation really, 2023 survey. I think that was a big one. So something like 5,000-6,000 respondents. And about a third of people were at least very worried. There was a global survey before that, maybe 2020 or 2021, of young people and children. And they found a majority, it might have not been far over half, but a majority had high levels of worry, sadness, anxiety, but also other things that they reported, like a sense of hopelessness as well as really widespread, and powerlessness, but and also maybe less expected, maybe not, feelings like guilt as well, and anger. So yeah, a kind of a real range of emotional responses, but increasingly prevalent. I think that's the key, from maybe a low base, but spreading to more and more people in terms of what comes with awareness, I suppose.
And it's pervasive, isn't it, as well? If you think about some of the last sort of like big cultural things that have been happening, even on television. So the coronation mentioned green issues for the first time. Chelsea Flower Show mentions green issues constantly. So there is this fact that if it was something that you were experiencing, it'd be quite hard to keep away from it because it is so frequently mentioned.
I agree. Yeah, I think there's still something strange about the way it's mentioned in the UK, anyway. And that strange is something about there is a certain way we allow each other to talk about it. But there are other ways that still seem to be off limits. And some kind of climate crisis commentators have talked about this in the past as a socially generated silence, or like an invisible force field where in polite society there are certain things you can't talk about. I still think that applies to some extent. We don't want to undermine each other's, understandably, things like our flights, going on holiday, or certain practices, and we don't want to think about it or talk about it as being catastrophic, climate crisis being catastrophic in our lifetime. So we joke about it, or we talk about doing our bit or trying to make a difference the best we can, and then we move on. So I think you're right, it's talked about more, and I am optimistic about that. It's part of the conversation for sure. And on the other hand, there is still, as a psychologist, I can't help but notice and pick up on research that talks about this, a kind of still a sense in which it's still not part of the narrative in some ways as well.
I wonder, I mean, we might not have this data yet, but is it our generations talking about it differently, our genders talking about it differently, or is that still, we don't have that data quite yet?
I don't think so. I think that from this is off the top of my head, but from what I've seen about climate denial, the younger you are, the less likely you are to engage in measures of climate denial. So if we were being really speculative, I think we're probably saying in general that it would be split broadly in terms of generations. And the same, I think, again, this is a real generalization and speculative, the same for endorsement of climate denial in US studies in particularly older, not just older, but you could guess, white men.
Yeah.
I
still, every time I think about it, I always think about that. See, congressman who brought like a snowball in to show people that snow existed still, and so climate change can't be real. Like,
yeah.
I'm not sure that you understand evidence. It was a really bizarre thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
there is something about visibility, isn't there, as well? If something's not visible, people don't feel they need to engage. I'm just reflecting because I live in York, and obviously periodically we have some serious floods, and one a few years ago that was really serious, and a lot of people lost their homes, and that was really visible because you could see, people's furniture on the street. You couldn't go into certain areas of York. I mean, I had to kind of wade through the streets from my house to we were completely cut off and on evacuation notice. And I think the community, which was brilliant, really came together to help people. And there was lots of relief in local churches, people, donating furniture, people offering strangers somewhere to live and sleep and things like that. And I really reflected on it. And I think for me, it was because it was so visible, whereas on the whole, climate change might not be as visible to people on a day-to-day basis, so people don't engage in it because they don't think it affects them. Yeah, I
think that's another part of the puzzle, isn't it? Is that and another way in which it's unprecedented. I mean, it might have been the Sadiq Khan talking about it at the weekend, pollution in London, and I think he said something about that invisibility, how different pollution is now. We can't see it or feel it a lot of the time. I mean, sometimes you can, the traffic smells, but compared to the smog of previous generations, we knew it was there. And yet it's deadly now, maybe more so, or certainly in different ways. And you're right, it's kind of intangible in a sense.
Yeah.
I think you're right, that spreads to it's so easy in an everyday sense to think that climate crisis couldn't really, break through and affect our daily life unless, like you say, in York and before that, lots of floods in Cornwall, unless it does. But even then, that study was, maybe it was because it was a while ago now, a few years, but in Cornwall, they did some follow-up research with people there. And afterwards, those people, they found that kind of resilience you talked about. And everyone was really, gratified by that. But in terms of the climate crisis, they actually found a slight dip in terms of people being willing to believe that anything like that could happen again, because they've been through it once psychologically. There was this defense mechanism that said, well, it's not going to happen again. No, it was a one-off. So they were actually slightly less likely to see it as a result of climate crisis than people who hadn't been through it. It's just complicated, isn't it? We're complicated in terms of dealing with these kinds of strange threats, I think, at the best of times.
Yeah.
Dave's got a question already. just joining in there. Love to see you, Dave. Is it healthy that we are anxious? Would it be more worrying if we weren't worried?
Yes, that's a great question. I'm glad someone asked that, because that's a key point I always try and make when I'm writing about it as well, is that this isn't a maladaptive response. This isn't a kind of pathological response for me. When I say this, I'm meaning a kind of anxious response, even if in terms of as a presentation
That you've
problematic. In some ways, it really could be. I don't want to be glib about that. For the individual, being anxious and feeling overwhelmed about the climate crisis is, or should be seen as, a normal and understandable response. And I would agree, it's a starting point for taking these issues seriously, individually and collectively. But it's a move away from denial, so it's a good thing. Again, not being glib there about people for whom it's combining with other issues, or it is really debilitating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing. So we've talked a little bit about kind of what it is, how prevalent it is. So we're talking as well about its impacts. So what kind of impacts does it have on individuals? I think you might have frozen there a little bit. Can you hear me?
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm still there. Yeah, in terms of the impacts it has on individuals, it will kind of look like the kinds of impacts that extreme sadness or worry will look like anywhere else, I think. But it might also mean, or it could potentially at least, a kind of withdrawal from engaging with those kinds of issues around climate crisis. That's a common response, in that we don't want to think about it. And we still live in a culture whereby it's made easier for us not to think about it, because we don't live in a culture, for most part. I know we've talked about increasing recognition, but we also live in a culture where it's at least contradictory. We're told to keep buying stuff and keep going wherever we want, and that we're entitled to this and we're entitled to that, and everything we want. So there's conflicting messages there, and I think it's very easy to retreat from engaging with the climate crisis and feeding those things into a kind of denial. And that's still, I think we all do that to some extent. I'm not just saying that's about other people. I think that is a common reaction. We retreat, and we can still find ways to retreat from those feelings. Another way is to kind of throw ourselves into individual action and to try the best as we can to take personal responsibility. Sometimes I engage with that as well. I try and do the things individually that I think matter. And again, there's already research that shows that how people can get really disillusioned with that, because it's the scale of the problem is that the impacts of our individual behaviors can't be seen with this kind of problem. So we get that kind of response as well. But yeah, between those two kind of pillars, we also get the kind of usual responses from sadness and worry. I think the most important thing there is whether there's an opportunity, whether it's in a mental health context, a clinic, or in a conversation, is whether people get the opportunity to articulate these feelings as legitimate and as recognizable.
Yeah, I could see that. So how might this manifest for staff coming across people with this experience? When do we worry? When do we say this is adaptive? Worry isn't the problem. At what point does it become something that maybe needs support?
Yeah, well, you'd be the better judge of that than I am, I'm sure. But I think it has to be a case-by-case basis. And I think in terms of the practitioner, we need to ask questions of ourselves about how ready and willing we are to recognize these kinds of issues as valid responses for a start. And that has to be, well, for me anyway, it has to be a starting point. Yeah, so I think we need to start by not underestimating the kind of the extent of that experience and how distressing it can be, and to recognize it in ourselves as well, and not to see it as something that's pathological in itself necessarily. So that's the first thing for me that's important, that we start to have those conversations and recognize as just. After that, it's the usual markers still, though. I mean, it's not helpful to say, well done, you're feeling anxious about something that you should feel anxious about, and off you go. So then it's about the kinds of distress that are feeling, and whether we can help people deal with something as overwhelming, some ways invisible, as we said, difficult, a wicked problem.
Yeah.
You know, we need to think about, and we can talk about this, you know, what kind of strategies could we suggest within and beyond a therapeutic situation for people to be able to deal with them in ways that still allow them to go on.
Yeah, I can see you've got some more questions there on WhatsApp, Vanessa.
Hold on. I've been busy tweeting, so I've not looked at them yet. I'll get on to that. Yeah, I've got just one here from Dave. We know about the benefit of green and blue spaces and taking holidays, especially on our mental health. How do we balance the two competing issues? Interesting.
Yeah. Another tough one. I mean, we kind of need to get social policy and infrastructure involved, I think, before we can resolve that issue. But for me, what are the signs? What are the movements already that people are dealing with this? Well, we've all probably heard at least vaguely of slow travel. Slow holidays now, and that's one thing. You know, one thing I see is I'm really optimistic about, where people are being encouraged to travel by train.
Yeah.
It takes a lot longer to get somewhere. And I know it's not cheap at the minute, and the systems don't always work. That's why I'm saying we need infrastructure. But there's something ecological in that. We're not flying, but there's also something psychological and around mental health, around getting some. You know, it's the getting there, not the destination. Also taking time to notice our environment as we travel, and spending more time doing that rather than it being about where we go. So, you know, that's one example of that, where a balance might be, in kind of repositioning how we think about what holiday is, you know, and what travel's for.
And whether you're just kind of going on a package holiday to a hotel and not engaging in the community that you're visiting, or whether you immerse yourself in the culture.
Yeah. But there are some, you know, it's a good question. Some really difficult decisions to be made about what we value. If we do take the climate crisis seriously, as including for those of us in relatively privileged positions, especially those of us, you know, how important are some things to us, and, you know, how do we prioritize? You know, if short and long-term haul flights become impossible, you know, what happens then? You know, what do we, what?
Yeah, that will be interesting, won't it? And I think you can't have these decisions unless we have an open discussion.
Yeah, and I think what I've seen before, and this is what we talk to our students about in terms of when we talk about engaging with people around the climate crisis, is it's so easy to put other people's back up. So what you can't go in there and say, you shouldn't be having a holiday. Why are you doing that? You shouldn't be flying, you know, on holiday. When, you know, the reason people go on holiday is we all go on holiday is bound up in the world we live in, and, you know, the ways that we work, and what's available to us, and the time we have, and so on and so forth. So, you know, for me, for most of us, it's not about trying to pinpoint individual blame and responsibility. It's about open conversations about what, you know, what we want and how we get there.
I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it, to get to a point of positive action taking from fear and shame and anxiety. Those things don't really lend themselves to positive empowered action, which is what we really need to take as a group now. So it's an interesting thing that you're pointing out there. The way that we speak to each other about this is a challenge, particularly if you are feeling that people aren't hearing you, or you are feeling that people aren't taking it as seriously as you were experiencing it. Yeah. So what can we do to manage sort of like a way forward with this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, in that recognizing that we're feeling these emotions to ourselves and with other people is a real start. I mean, I think that's only just happening culturally. And we're seeing more in my world, psychology and research. We see much more research on how people respond emotionally, psychologically to climate crisis, whether it's in their local space or anticipatory. We're seeing much more research to try and come up with terminology for that. That's why this talk is happening, right? Because eco-anxiety is on people's register more. So that's a good thing in itself. The conversation is beginning, So we're articulating that. And I say it's a good thing because the alternative is to pretend it's not happening, to engage in those forms of denial, ourselves individually and collectively. So that's a really important start. But then on a kind of individual level, how do we manage that? I tend to take quite a political perspective on it, and that's not to assume. I think we should be wary of assuming that we can fix this through individual behavior change, including our own behavior change. And I think in some ways that's quite liberating, because I'm not going to fix this on my own. I'm not going to fix this by doing more recycling or by not flying on holiday. I'm not going to do it by trying to accumulate enough individual activities. So I need to let myself off the hook a little bit there, and not over focus on those individual behavior changes. But I will do them, but because they feel right to me. But on the other hand, if we're thinking about individual behavior change, then what can we do? Then there is research that suggests, this, especially with young people who might be experiencing more anxiety, is how do we encourage a sense of agency? So individual behavior change for me is about finding ways to connect with the people about these issues, and it might be protest, it might be joining a group, it might be pushing for collective change in other ways, but that research suggests that can help create a sense of agency, as well as a sense of belonging, a sense of optimism, and it mitigates that sense of individual powerlessness and hopelessness as well, while still engaging with and recognizing that there are problems not easily fixed.
I've got a couple of questions coming through, but before we get to those, I'd like to just talk about some other part of your work as well, if you don't mind. So you're talking about kind of individual experience there, and it kind of leads us on to this kind of decline in neighbourhood green space. I wondered if there's anything that you would like to sort of just foreground on that.
Yeah, well, what we haven't really talked about yet today is our connection to nature, because we are nature. So sometimes I say humans and the rest of nature, but our connection to the natural world. But in a way, that's the only thing we're talking about. It's that natural world that we are part of that is in crisis. And one thing that seems to be really important, this is where the strongest evidence base is in the last 30, 40 years, is that having a meaningful, especially a kind of routine or consistent connection with nature, really broadly defined, is really good for our mental health, all of the things considered. So what I think part and parcel of any kind of solution to climate crisis has to be trying to facilitate a nature connection in people, so that connection is there and people's mental health is better, so that first of all, they're coming from, it's a tool, so they're coming from a stronger place, they're more resilient in terms of engaging with all sorts of issues. Also that connection to nature is evidence suggests that that's also a basis for wanting to care for, protect and defend the natural environment. The stronger our connection to it makes sense on an everyday level, doesn't it? The stronger our sense of connection to the natural world, the more willing we are to care for and defend it. So it's really important in that sense, if we want to kind of create a groundswell of activism or care for that natural world. And the flip side, the more we feel like there is no nature, or nature's off at some distance or outside or away from us, then the less likely we are to feel like we need to protect it or care for it. It almost becomes something externalized out there. That's especially dangerous as it's increasingly under threat. So you talked earlier about injustice, and again, it's one of those things whereby on the whole, the poorer we are, the further we tend to live from a natural environment, even a decent park. So that kind of access is also I would say, and mental health charities are often saying this now, it should be thought of as a right to have that kind of routine, regular access, because at the minute that's really socially stratified.
And I think some town planners and councils are starting to plan it in, aren't they, to new developments to think about kind of access to green space, and even things like the route to walk to a park for a parent with their children and things. So it's really good that that's been looked at within the infrastructure. But I agree, there's a massive inequality in this discussion, isn't there? And I think COVID kind of brought that to light, didn't it? When we saw people in high-rise buildings that couldn't go out and have access to that green space, and then others amongst us who've got a bit more privilege who were able to access nature really easily. And I think that really, for me, brought it to light.
Absolutely,
yeah. And the lack of space in the UK and England, the lack of public space that there is, that we have a right to access, is that might seem like a distant issue from what we're talking about. For me, those kind of issues are all interlinked. So the fact that we don't have access to a great deal of land in the UK is part of that problem. But also, we've been positive in COVID, when everything else was stripped away, so many things we couldn't do, lots of people rediscovered just being outside as a wonderful thing.
It's true. And just, I the thing that I remember the most was, being able to hear birds in nature, because the sounds were so amplified without all the traffic and all the other noise and, pollution. It was amazing, really, in that sense. But I think as well, just thinking about communities, thinking about mental health hospitals and people who are detained under the Mental Health Act, making sure that they've got access to space. Certainly, working in prisons, which can be a very kind of grey environment, having sort of horticultural projects that go on in prisons, and just I know one of the female prisons where one of the nurses does yoga outside on the grass with the women, and just that sort of creative thinking to ensure that people still have that access, because, as you say, it's so good for the mind, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the kind of work on Nature Connection really kicked off in the 1980s, and partly around institutional studies, including prisons, where even things like they compared prisons that had a view of the outside compared to those that only had a view towards the inside atrium. And it was only a measure like reduced number of sick days, but even then, a really significant difference just in terms of view of nature. And that kind of research has been reproduced over and over and over again for, getting on 40 years now. So
we've got a couple of, I think we're getting closer to the end again.
We already.
But, we've got a couple of comments come in. So Roy, thank you very much for your comment, Roy. Roy Wiggins saying, I'm not sure I agree with the assumption that older generation are in denial. The older generation did not live in the throwaway society that exists today. They're very adept at recycling and reuse. Another question, this is a good one. Get ready, coming at you. Do health professionals have a public health duty to campaign and protest? I mean, if we've all signed up to promote the public good, should we be on the front lines? And just another one to think about is there something we should be doing in school, given that young people are highlighting anxiety on this issue? So one about school and particularly targeting young people, and the other one about, should health professionals be handcuffing themselves to something today?
That first one, I didn't want to glide over the age question. I did say it was generalization. Of course, there are all sorts of differences. But in terms of public health, for me, maybe this is just personal, but I'm really reluctant to tell other people what they should and shouldn't do in terms of activism and kind of political statements. Because for one thing, it really depends on how safe and secure you feel in doing that. And people's different experiences in the past and their social position will really shape how they feel about that. So it's each their own. And I also think you should never tell people to do anything that you're not willing to do yourself. So I have been involved in activism, but I'm not, for my own reasons, including having a family, but other people might have valid reasons, I'm not willing to get myself arrested at the moment. So, I've got my own boundaries. So how could I say that to anyone else? Do we have a responsibility as health professionals to speak out about these issues? Yes, I think we do. I think that's a no-brainer. So we need to actively do things like question climate denial. And we need to take responsibility for being informed about these kinds of issues, so that if we're dealing with clients or students or whatever it might be, we're not reproducing the problem. We are being able to have those conversations we started this conversation with, allowing people to articulate it and coming to terms with these issues ourselves. So there's that. That's what I'd say. And the second point, what was the second point again? Sorry,
Children and young people in schools.
Yeah, well, this is something I've said before, but I think it's essential. I think, we should be engaging with two things. One, the reality of climate crisis, but presented in a way that's not hopeless, but also nature-based education, much more, from a nature-based curriculum from an early age. And, those two things really important to me, in terms of what we could be doing at the level of the curriculum, taking classroom outdoors, all sorts of things,
There's two or three things you're sort of kind of coming around as a theme, aren't they? So one is that free and open discussion that's not turning away from the truth of the situation, the seriousness of the situation, but also role modeling that kind of proactivity about it. Because I think you're right. The idea of just being overcome by doom and panic is not going to really take any of us forward. And I think as well, the idea about exposure to the natural world being so important, because you protect what you love, don't you? And if you don't know anything about it, you don't place a value on it. So I think it was almost like the things you're saying about how we would best respond as a society, just do exactly the same for children and young people, which kind of makes sense, to be honest. I think we're coming towards the end now. So Vanessa, is there anything that you wanted to bring up or to touch on?
Yeah, we haven't really touched much on our relationship between nature and animals and humans as well. So I was interested in your thoughts around that, really, because I know that's one of the areas that you research and study in as well.
Yeah, I just think it's when we think about human connection to nature, that can sometimes feel really abstract, and nature is something out there or away. For me, it's a really important way of thinking through the issues when we think about our specific connections, and they can be to place, they can also be to animals. And sometimes that's just about positive. So we know that, again, in COVID, companion animals have been really important for people's mental health.
Yeah, hugely.
And a real focus. But also it's around some of the dangers and difficulties in our society. When we think about where COVID might have come from, or at least lots of viruses are coming from, it's because human nature or human society is really buffering up against animal spaces and habitats, and that's creating all sorts of problems in terms of the spread of viruses. And industrialized animal agriculture is also part of the climate crisis problem. So our connection to important but complicated part of these issues for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
I'm ending up with more questions than I am with answers, but I suppose that's a sign that conversation is useful, isn't it? Is there anything, Matt, that you wanted to focus back on?
I guess to round it off, I guess I'd come back to the politics of this issue. I know this is about psychology, and I'm a psychologist, but the psychiatrist Elizabeth Pinsky, I read something by her in the US, and she said, and she puts it pithily, I believe the fundamental and best treatment for climate distress, drumroll, is a rapid and just transition from fossil fuels. And I like that, because what it's saying is, yes, we can engage, and yes, we need to make sure that try and make sure people are doing okay as health professionals, as psychologists, without moving away from the fundamental point that what we really need is a social and political and structural change to get us out of this mess.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone's going to top that finishing statement. Nice quote. We'll definitely put that out for you guys. And for anyone who's been watching along, we've also tweeted out links to articles and blogs written by Matt that will really maybe help you deepen your understanding of this. And if it's a topic that you want us to revisit, please let us know, because I think we're at the start of this topic and we're nowhere near the end. This is going to be a long story, I think. But just really thank you, Vanessa, for being there, being brilliant. And thank you very much to our special guest, Matt, and to Dave, obviously, as well. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dave.
Take care.
Nicky.
See you.
Night.
Night.